When I think about a time that I saw God, I don't think of a church or a stained glass window. I don't think of a grand miracle or a blinding light. I think of a small, ordinary house in a small Irish town, the sound of a bell ringing in the night, and a tiny front room where my grandmother spent her final days. I come from a large family, a very large family. I have 49 first cousins. Yes, that's right, 49 first cousins. Like, can you imagine this? My mother was the youngest of 9, and she and my father had 8 children of their own, and many of my mother's siblings also had very large families. So growing up in a small town with that many first cousins, uncles, and aunts was quite an experience, as you can imagine, from everyone knowing your business and news getting back to my mother that I was, God forbid, seen talking to a boy in town. But it also meant growing up surrounded by people who loved me. My mother's father died when she was just 19, leaving my grandmother, Hannah Ryan, known simply to most in that small Irish town as Granny Ryan, living alone in the family home. She never got used to the quiet at night. So it became the custom for someone to stay with her. First my mother, then after she married, the grandchildren took turns. Once we were old enough, we would spend a week at a time keeping Granny company. And this duty was shared amongst the grandchildren who were of age, probably from the time when we were 10 or 11, until we finished secondary school and went on to a job or went on to university. So given that my mother was the youngest of 9, it came to be that myself and my siblings were among the youngest of the cousins and the ones who got to spend time with Granny in her final years. Looking back, I realize now what a gift those weeks with Granny were to me. As a shy, very introverted middle child in a loud, busy house of 8 children, those quiet evenings gave me something rare, the undivided attention of a beloved adult, and it was a balm for my soul. And so it was that come 7 p.m. on a Sunday evening, I would get dressed in my school uniform, a white, stiff collared shirt, a bottle green tie, a bottle green A-line skirt, white knee socks pulled up, of course, all the way to the knees, and black patent shoes. I would pack my school books into my backpack, strap it on my back, hop on my blue bike with the very sporty racer handlebars, and ride down to Granny's, about 10 minutes into town on my bike. Most likely, she would greet me with a cup of tea and a slice of apple tart that she had made earlier, for she was a wonderful baker and made the most wonderful brown bread, and I would take my fill of fresh bread and tea and homemade jam and fresh creamy golden butter for my breakfast in the mornings and bask contentedly in these small ordinary rituals of care. This routine continued every 6 weeks or so for several years, and then as my older cousins started to age out, it was every 4 weeks, and then it was every 3 weeks, and as my grandmother's health began to decline and she needed more care, it was myself and one other cousin who pretty much alternated weeks with Granny. By the time I was 16, time with Granny was very different. No longer able to take the stairs, a bed was made for her downstairs in the tiny front room. Soon, because of weakness in her legs, she needed a commode in her room as she was unable to make it to the bathroom. A bell was set up in her room that she would ring if she needed assistance in the middle of the night. It was typical to get up at least once a night to assist her to the bathroom, to the commode. As time went on and old age continued to make itself known in her body, She became too weak to use the commode, and a bedpan was needed. The ringing of the night bell became more frequent, sometimes 4 or even 5 times in the night. And then I'd wake in the morning and go to school. It was what one did. It was what I did at the age of 16, and believe me when I say I loved every minute of it. What I couldn't name then, but I see now, is that those nights were holy ground. In the dark stillness, in the small acts of care, in the simple presence of staying close, God was there. Now one night stands out. It had been a restless night. Granny's mind seemed to wander back to her childhood. She would call out for her long-departed parents and siblings, and she seemed caught between this world and the next, fearful of what was coming. I remember this night sitting by her side and holding her hand. Her hand was light and bird-like, almost translucent in mine. Suddenly, she opened her eyes, looked straight at me, clear and intent in a way she hadn't been for weeks. She feebly squeezed my hand and said, "My darling Betty, you're wonderful." And then as quickly as the moment arrived, the moment was gone. It was the last cognizant moment I had with my grandmother. Now, my name is not Betty. But you may not know this, my family calls me Etty. It's my family nickname. So I decided that was close enough. I claimed this blessing for all it was worth, and to this day, I cling to it tightly. Later, I shared that moment with my aunt and my godmother, the real Betty in the family. She scoffed and declared, "My mother would never have said something like that to me." For you see, my grandmother had been a strict, no-nonsense woman and mother of her generation, not one to give praise easily, least of all to her own children, and this had left some very deep wounds. But perhaps in those final days, something in Granny had softened. Perhaps that moment of unexpected tenderness was meant for both of us, Betty and Etty. I think my sharing of this moment brought a softening to my aunt, and I think perhaps a little healing too, because God was there in that fleeting moment of clarity, in the warmth of a hand held, and in words of love too long unspoken. My last moments with my grandmother, and I owe some of the details of this afternoon to a recent cherished conversation with my own mother. I sat quietly in the back of the small front room. The room was busier now as Granny's children, my aunts, uncles, and my mother, had come to be present to her in what had appeared to be her last hours. The priest had been summoned to administer last rites. Granny was very restless, fearful still, terrified of dying. Taught as she had been to see God more as a judge than as a companion. I watched the life pulse through her frail body, the pulsing of her blood literally moving down her arm and then receding with each heartbeat. Sometimes the blood reached her fingertips, coloring them purpley blue, sometimes only to her wrist, leaving her fingers white and silvery, and sometimes only to her lower arm. It was so amazing to me at such a young age to literally witness the life draining from her. I saw in a way few 16-year-olds do, the sacredness and awe of a life ebbing away. And then with a long sigh, that seemed to release the tensions of the world, she stopped breathing. We sat in silence, and the priest quietly began the prayers for the dead. And then, maybe 2 minutes later, from the bed came this sound. And my grandmother took a sudden, deep breath, and she was back. But this time, she was different. She was really different. And you could sense it and you could feel it in the room. She was lighter somehow, and any sense of fear or dread of dying had been lifted from her. She opened her eyes and said very clearly, "I'm very happy now." And from that moment on, those were her words. "I'm very happy now." Her fear was gone. Something unseen had met her in the quiet space between breaths and left her with peace. She lived for a few more days, peaceful and ready, before slipping away quietly in the night. So where did I see God? I saw God in that front room beside that bed, in the vespers-like ringing of the night bell, in easing her discomfort, in her whispered prayers of thanks be to God. I saw God as a companion who came to ease the way for a soul's transition to the afterlife. I saw God in the words, "I am happy now." I saw God in a small Irish house, in a tiny front room, in frail hands held, in fears quieted, in love whispered across generations. I saw God breaking in quietly in the unnoticed places where love shows up and fears are lifted, where peace is found. I felt God's presence in the calling of the night bell. And my prayer for you and for all of us this morning is simple. Keep your eyes open. God is indeed still showing up in kitchens, in tiny front rooms, in care homes, in conversations, in kindness, right here and right now. Sometimes we look for God in thunder and triumph, but more often, God appears in presence, where hearts are soft, where kindness persists, where someone whispers, "My darling, you're wonderful."